Day 6 was Nature and Land Use Day, where negotiators were working into the night after a very busy day. Now, in terms of new announcements, there was the pledge by 45 governments to take urgent action and investment in order to protect nature and shift to more sustainable ways of farming. So that's on the political agenda at the very least. Of relevance to the UK, there was the announcement that the UK set a target of 75% of farmers who are to be engaged in low carbon practices by 2030. This includes the Gilbert Initiative, which is to coordinate investment in research. And there was UK funding announced of some £38.5 million over 2 years to go to the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, which is, I've been told, the world's leading agricultural science and innovation organization. So a lot going into innovation in agriculture in particular today. Further to that, the Global Action Agenda on Innovation in Agriculture was announced. That comes with a huge amount of money, $4 billion from over 150 states, businesses, research institutions, and farmer groups themselves. Further progress has already been made on some of the announcements that we heard earlier this week. So, firstly, an additional £65 million was announced to support the Just Rural Transition, which is to help developing countries shift their policies and practices to more sustainable agricultural and food production, agriculture being a leading cause of biodiversity loss and deforestation in particular. So that's very welcome. And speaking of deforestation, listeners will undoubtedly remember the big announcement of the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use. When that was announced earlier this week, it covered 85% of the world's forests. Now, some 34 further countries have signed up, and that brings the total of the world's forests covered by this pledge to 91%. So that's very exciting. And of course, we cannot forget the world's oceans. On this topic, just over 100 countries have now signed up to the 30 by 30 target, which is the target to protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. Finally, 95 high-profile companies, very high-profile, some of them from a range of sectors, have now committed to being nature positive. And that includes a very interesting partnership between Sainsbury's and the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, that will be something to keep an eye on. On this, and crucially, these firms have all agreed under this initiative to having their activities verified through the Science-Based Targets for Nature initiative. So some robust accountability put in place there. And on Nature Positive, I am delighted to have had an opportunity to speak with Stephanie Wray, who is the managing director of the Nature Positive business within RSK, who was not prevented by some, from what I understand, 100,000 protesters from talking to UKELA on all things nature positive, which is something we are definitely going to hear a great deal about in the coming years. And so we are here to discuss all things nature positive.
Nature positive is really the equivalent, if you like, of net zero for carbon. So it's that target that we're all aiming for, the point where we'll bend the curve on biodiversity and flip from constant biodiversity decline back into enhancement and protecting. So it's the target we're all aiming for. And biodiversity net gain, if you like, as applied in the UK, is one of the tools to get us there, really.
And you spoke about bending the curve. I think the UK in particular has one of the steepest curves in the world, the most nature depleted nation in Europe, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely.
And so the aim is, from what I understand, to bend that curve basically now and to get it on a trajectory up by 2030. Is that right? And is that achievable in your mind? Because that is incredibly soon. We're talking about you can't just plant a tree and have automatic reversal of biodiversity. These things need to live and colonize, and species are unpredictable. So is this achievable?
Species are unpredictable, but very tenacious. So give nature the space, give it the opportunity, and you can do great things. So whilst I think, it's a hugely ambitious target, I think it is possible if we start doing something right now. And that means really quite big changes, quite big societal changes in how we use land, really. It's not as simple as one policy like biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of the issue that everybody has to tackle, and of course UKELA members are going to be deeply interested in, because land it really has to do more than one thing now. I think that's what the consensus that we're hearing. It has to produce our food. Some 71%, I think, of the UK's land is in agricultural use, for example. But it can't just do that now, because if we want to achieve biodiversity net gain and nature positive by 2030, as well as mitigate climate change and adapt and hopefully get to net zero through nature-based solutions to mitigate climate change. The same piece of land has to accomplish all of these things. Are there examples of case studies where you can think of land doing that and it's achievable at scale?
Absolutely. Traditionally, people would have used the land for all of their needs, wouldn't they? They wouldn't have segmented it off into this is land where we do this and this is land where we do that. That was just your piece of land. That was a piece of land where Indigenous people lived, and it served all their needs. And I think we need to think about what our needs are, what are the benefits that nature can provide us, and how can we make sure that we're restoring the land to a condition where it can actually deliver all those benefits again. So when we look at a piece of land and we think it's for development, say, well, what are the biodiversity benefits? What are the landscape community benefits? The educational benefits? What else can it do for us rather than just be, a piece of land with a concrete box on it?
Now, this is one of the interesting topics coming forward, I think, with the Environment Bill, is how this biodiversity net gain is going to be leveraged, I guess, to the most effective use. So from what I understand, the aim will be primarily to provide net gain on the site itself that's subject to the development proposal. Well, planning permission, because you wouldn't get it if you don't get the permission. But what's your view on the potential? It's a bit like the affordable housing debate, because people will say, we can get you 3 affordable housing on this very costly plot of land, but if you let us build the affordable housing somewhere else, we can get you 10. So is your view that this is potentially a policy that should be given a bit more nuance? So maybe, yes, emphasis on the actual land subject to development is a good thing, because everybody should have access to nature, but also maybe take into account where you can leverage that for that pot of money for net gain to the greatest possible benefit to biodiversity with these nature recovery networks or adjacent habitat to protected sites. There's a lot of opportunities where potential gains for biodiversity might be greater than on the site itself. So what's your view on that potentially thorny question?
Absolutely. It is a huge problem in biodiversity net gain at the moment, and not least because, although the Environment Act the bill is back in the Commons at the moment while we're talking, but so it's not even achieved royal assent, and then there's been lots of secondary legislation to resolve. So really, the sort of market for biodiversity credits and biodiversity net gain is the Wild West at the moment.
Yeah.
So yes, there's a huge amount of debate around where you can deliver the most benefit, and I think I'm a consultant, so I obviously work in 2x2 matrices. So you need to think in these 2 dimensions of what are the real big strategic biodiversity priorities we have as a country or a region, and what can we do to support those? And that's where you take the expert views into account, and then what are the things that are important to local people who are affected by this development, which may not be the same things, and then you take local voices into account. And you need to balance a trade-off between those 2 things as you have a finite pot of money. So my approach would be follow the mitigation hierarchy, try not to lose anything in the first place, reduce down your impacts as far as you possibly can before you even get to think about offsetting. And then when it comes to offsetting, do the biodiversity net gain where it will do the most good, balancing those local and strategic priorities.
I think that's really sensible advice. And from what you're saying, it sounds like once we get the draft targets published and net gain's not going to actually come into force for 2 years. They've said there's this long lead-in time for implementation. I think that's absolutely right, because, as you said, it seems a bit of a Wild West now where people are looking at the potential financial figures and going out and buying Audis if you're a farmer, because the figures are enormous.
The figures are, I've seen DEFRA produced figures saying it would be £50,000 a unit, would be a typical figure for a biodiversity unit. We have seen local authorities charging 20-25. In one particular case, I know it was a very small proportion of a unit that a developer needed, but the unit equivalent would have been about £100,000 a unit. Because obviously there's issues of scale. If you only want a tiny bit, there's a lot of the setup costs are still there. So there's no real market formed with any kind of market rules yet. We don't really know how it's going to operate. But it is important. Nature's hugely important for people, so it is important to try and do what we can on development sites, but not to the extent of squeezing every last unit in there just to make the point that we've delivered it locally, where it wouldn't necessarily add any greater value. So that's when you find people playing tunes with the metrics. Oh well, if I plant this kind of woodland here, I'll get more units than if I put in a nice wildflower meadow. But actually, a wildflower meadow might have been the appropriate habitat to create. It might have been of more benefit to the local people who could sit and look out their windows at it and so on. So, you've got to try and do this with the right intent.
Absolutely right. I remember when DEFRA tweaked or published the 3.0 metric with the increased emphasis on hedgerows, they're all of a sudden saying, well, where can we put in more hedgerows?
Right,
and like you said, it might not have been appropriate actually, but the metric, what you measure,
that's how well behaved.
Exactly. So really, really interesting, but something to keep an eye on. One thing for listeners that I'd like to highlight is my impression is that it's very good, but Steph, you're the expert here. There was a report published in September by the nature conservation agencies in the UK nations called Nature Positive 2030. And that came up with recommendations for taking this forward and achieving net nature positive by 2030. And three of the main themes that I got from that report were, one, the need to mainstream nature's recovery so that it becomes a core part of decision making, including for the finance sector. And I really want to pick that up with you, Steph.
Yeah.
Secondly, to protect and enhance nature underpinned by science-based targets, which we've touched on from coming our way with the Environment Bill, Future Environment Act. And thirdly, to transition to the sustainable use of our land and seas by tackling main drivers of biodiversity loss. So going one by one, I think one's the potentially really interesting one, because hitherto we haven't really... nature conservation and nature biodiversity enhancement has been a land use issue. It's never been a finance issue. So getting the private sector and finance involved here is potentially game changing from what I understand, because we've got the case studies, we know what we need to do, but it's been a matter of scale and affording it really. So what role does finance play going forward in your view? And is this a sustainable one? Is it going to be mainstreamed with finance, or is that really going to be a bolt on to the traditional way of protecting land, monitoring what species are there, and then enhancing where we can? Is the way things are being done going to change fundamentally by bringing finance into the picture?
Yes, I think it will happen, but I think what would happen first is a fundamental change in finance. There's an awful lot wrapped up in that apparently simple point about mainstreaming biodiversity.
Yeah.
And if we start with that as a principle, we need to see biodiversity and nature positive on the same footing as net zero. We're all focused on net zero, how to get our carbon footprint down. But your carbon footprint, our impacts on the climate are one aspect, they're one ecosystem service, and it's just ignoring all of the others. Water quality,
Pollution,
soil,
absolutely.
Pollinators, all of those things, everything is derived from nature. So if you just dig back a little further into understanding your impacts on the planet, then you'll kind of deal with climate incidentally as you're managing your impacts on nature. And what we're doing at the moment is that there's so much effort, there is so much political will and corporate time and regulatory activity around carbon footprint, around net zero targets. If we just broaden that out and think, okay, that's just one part of what we're going to do, then we're going to make progress so much faster. on the financial thing, yes, I agree. If you want to see how organisations behave, how governments behave, how to borrow money, so what we need is for the finance sector to really embrace this and mainstream it within there. And I'd say there's huge will for that to happen. I actually have lots of conversations with people in that sector all the time, and there's huge interest. They recognise this is something that they need to do, but there seems to be this one stumbling first step that needs to be taken.
And what is that first step? How do you overcome that hurdle?
Well, the first step is if we go back to the Glasgow report published earlier this year, then that was a very clear call, and in fact, there was nothing new. There was nothing new in the Glasgow report around.
Natural capital's been around for a long, long time. Yeah. Nobody really understood it until Glasgow just clarified it for us. But absolutely right, Steph. We've had it. We know it.
We know this. What was important? What was the sort of landmark moment with the Glasgow report? So it was published by the Treasury. This was the Treasury telling us there was a different way to value projects, society, our economy. And that's huge. And then we got a great positive response to the report from the government. But what we haven't then seen is
the
government
translation.
policy translating that into how it works. And starting to bring in these things that have traditionally been thought of as externalities into the decision-making process. I mean, yes, what we do have Green Book and Agenda Book processes in government are looking at these values and priorities, but it's not really, because it's not monetized, it doesn't have the same impact in decision making. And I think that this idea that we need to move on from GDP to a wider measure of inclusive wealth is what's going to change and really drive that change.
Yeah, and there's a strong movement for that.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of money, there's a lot of institutional investors who are excited about this, who want to invest in nature. We've got lots of aims for ethical or impact investing, and yet there's just not quite processes that will guarantee them a return from doing so to allow that to link up with the thousands and thousands of acres of land of landowners who are thinking, well, my subsidies are going post-Brexit. I need to think of new ways to make a living from my land. And frankly, would love to see nature return to their land in the way that it was in the time of their grandfather, for example. So, both sides want this to happen, and we just need the policy environment to make it link up.
To let that money flow, really.
Absolutely.
Are you aware, and I'm asking you to be a policy, on top of being a managing director, a policy analyst and a drafter, a government strategist. So a difficult question. Sorry, Steph, for putting you in all three shoes. But what do you think would be the way to get there? What policies do we need? And do you know if that work's being done now? I'm assuming it is, but to be perfectly frank with you, I don't know what the Treasury has done with the Glasgow report beside saying, look, we've, brandishing it and saying we've done really good things, aren't we wonderful? But like you say, we haven't seen that translation into policy. It was published, a long time ago, relatively long time ago now. So I'm interested to hear what we've seen happen, what we might see happen, and what you think should happen in terms of policy.
In terms of policy, some of the positive steps I think that are being taken around funding into conservation, funding into sort of species strategies, into site strategies, into the nature recovery networks and so on. The big change in policy, it's not biodiversity net gain, spoilers. Although, biodiversity net gain is a big change for development. Development is about 7% of our land area. As you said earlier, 70% of our land area is farm. So the big policy change is the removal of perverse incentives, removal of agricultural subsidies that do harm to the environment, and replacing that with the new environmental land management scheme where farmers will get paid to do good, to deliver public goods. And we still don't know the detail of that, exactly how it will be, and there's a transitional period of several years. But potentially that has the power to do enormous good and to drive funding into the right kind of natural capital benefits. And once that establishes a market, private money can follow. I do see good signs in government investing in training of these agricultural agricultural environment advisors, so farmers can get good advice about how to deliver both food production and other natural capital benefits at the same time.
Is that an alliance with Natural England, or is that a separate project? Because this is new and it sounds really interesting.
It's a sort of collaborative project with a number of partners. The Chester Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management involved in it. So it's these things are happening. There's a lot going on in this space, and so I'm optimistic about how that will turn out, I would say.
Good. Well, at least it seems they're aware of the problem and they're developing iterative solutions to it, which I think when you're having such a radical change as Brexit and post-cap, probably that's the safest way to do it. It's not going to please everybody, but it stops disasters from being put in place. Hopefully.
Exactly. And it gives us the opportunity to start different ways of thinking about how we use land. It's not just a lot of the subsidies in the past for environmental stewardship and so on were plants and hedges, do a few conservation headlands and so on. They're sort of playing around the edges of the farming, and it's good to see ideas around regenerative farming and restoring soil coming into these sorts of schemes now, where it's like, it's not decoration around the edge, it's your whole approach, it's how you go about farming, how we do food production for the future that will grow better food, better nutritional qualities for people, as well as delivering on some of these nature conservation benefits.
Well, this is, you've touched on one of the things that soil is what everybody is talking about with groundswell, and it's an international movement really to restore soil health. And I don't know if this is inaccurate or an alarmist figure, but somebody told me that within 60 years, if we don't turn around soil depletion, we're going to have a real crisis in food production. So does that tie into nature positive? Is it all combined? Because obviously soil health is associated with getting to net zero and mitigating climate change, because healthy soil absorbs more carbon. And if you don't turn it all the time, then you're releasing less as well. So there's that benefit. And does that also have a benefit in terms of biodiversity?
Well, absolutely it does, yeah. Soil is the basis of everything, isn't it? If you've got healthy soils, then you'll have healthy soil microbiomes, the bacteria and fungi, and all of those nutrient cycling processes will work better.
Which supports a more biodiverse.
Biodiverse plant layer, which supports the animals that live on that. And so, it's not the sexiest part of biodiversity. It's clearly one of the most important.
Let's make soil sexy. That's the tagline for today. But that's really fascinating. So you get benefits in terms of sustainable food production, benefits in terms of carbon sequestration and reduced release of carbon, and benefits in terms of biodiversity. So you can achieve all of this. Really, really exciting.
And we need to do that. We're a small island, so we need to think about sort of stacking those natural capital benefits one on another. We can't partition it up and go, well, this is, Lincolnshire, we just grow carrots. We don't need to worry about anything else. It's going to grow some spuds, it'll be fine. We need to be thinking, well, what else do we need our land to do? It's got to work hard for us. It's got to provide employment. It's got to provide recreation and enjoyment. It's got to support nature. It's got to make sure that we're not suffering from flooding. It's got to help us in adaptation to climate change. There's so much, the land has to work hard for us, and we've got to treat it right to allow it to do that.
Yeah, and let it do it for the long term.
Yeah.
Speaking of long term, now I understand we had COP26 is on everyone's minds. That's why we're here and talking, and I'm having the extreme great pleasure of talking to you, Steph. But we've had, correct me if I'm wrong, COP16 in Kunming, which is the net 15. I'm so sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm doing COP16 next year. COP15 in Kunming in China, where because we're in a pandemic, it's slightly unusual arrangement, but we're looking at developing through that process the next decade of the framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So you're familiar with this process, being an expert on biodiversity, all things biodiversity and nature. So Steph, where are we with that process? And are you happy with where we are? And what do you think? Would you like to see as an outcome ultimately from those negotiations in Copenhagen?
We've seen the draft post-2020 biodiversity framework. It's terrifying, isn't it? We've already been 2 years into that.
Yeah, we're rapidly losing time to do something.
Ecological restoration.
Yeah.
20% of the way through by the time we actually ratify it. But the draft is really, it sets up quite ambitious vision of a world living in harmony with nature by 2050. And it's very clear on some of the really transformative steps that will involve. Now, the UK government has already indicated that it intends to sign it. And if we do so, then it's lining up some really quite important steps. Things like making sure that 30% of our land and seas are managed for the benefit of nature conservation, which is a huge step forward. Personally, I'd push for 50. But
Well, like you say, land, we can do more than one thing with land. It doesn't have to be siloed off and nobody touches it. Yeah. So, yeah, we could accomplish more, but maybe we can have the same ratcheting effect with the CBD as we do with Paris. It seems to be working here.
Indeed. Yeah, I think that's it. But what I'm hoping for is that this time we see more of a transition plan in the way that with carbon organisations being asked to, well, let's set out your demonstrably achievable transition plan rather than just saying, oh yeah, I'll be net zero and my finger in the air 2045.
And then just letting it happen. Yeah, exactly. Market-based solutions.
We'll get one of those massive carbon sucking machines.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have 1 year to just do it all at the end of that period.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not going to happen with nature. And the further we leave
it can't. It's impossible. It's just not going to happen.
This week at COP we had the announcement on zero deforestation, and that was released with a big fanfare that will stop deforestation by 2030. And that, don't get me wrong, it's a great thing to sign up to. But if you look at the IT targets, we were supposed to have reported biodiversity loss, which would require us to stop deforestation by 2020.
Right, so we're nowhere remotely close
This is
to
a new policy to be released with fanfare. This is something that we're already 2 years late.
Yeah, are you encouraged by the money that's been attached to that now? So it's been warmed up, absolutely. Served now with some money on the side.
Money, yeah, which is really helpful. But, money is.
Well, how do you do it otherwise? Yeah.
Exactly. I think what we need is for us all to take more responsibility, not to push that responsibility to developing countries with that tropical forest with the side of money, but to actually partner with them. We're the ones creating the demand for those forest-based commodities, so we have a lot more power than we're perhaps suggesting in how we resolve that problem.
Well, it's been an absolutely huge pleasure. Thank you so much, Steph, for your expertise. I know UKELA members will have learned an enormous amount, and it's encouraging. We're getting there, but we've got a huge amount to do in the next, within this decade. So
there is a huge amount to do. It's just a matter of not sitting back on our laurels and waiting till it's nearly 2030 to start rounding it up, going, okay, well, we need to have done a quarter of that in the next.
Yeah. Well, your phone will be ringing off the hook then. Thank you so much again.